Breaking tonight from the Swiss Alps, a Canadian Prime Minister just delivered the speech that Europe's been desperately waiting for. Mark Carney didn't just address the World Economic Forum. He seized the moment when American leadership collapsed and declared that Canada would fill the vacuum. Here's what nobody saw coming. Davos, Switzerland, Tuesday morning. The world's economic, media, and political elite gathered in the same wood-paneled conference hall where they have assembled for decades. But this time, something was different. The atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was fearful. Donald Trump had just won re-election. His bizarre demands were escalating daily. European leaders were scrambling to figure out how to respond to an increasingly erratic America without destroying the transatlantic alliance that's anchored Western security for 80 years. And then Carney walked to the podium. He started with a story. A 1978 essay by Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who would later become his nation's first post-communist president. Havel had written about a grocer in Prague who hung a sign in his shop window, "Workers of the world unite." Not because the grocer believed it, not because he wanted to, but because every grocer had to hang that sign in every window. This was what it meant to live under Soviet rule. This was what Havel called living within a lie. The room went silent. Translation? Carney just connected the horrors of Soviet communism with current American imperialism, and he did it in a room full of Europeans who are being forced to choose between dignity and survival. Think about the calculation behind that opening. Carney knew exactly who was in that audience. German industrialists watching their export markets threatened by tariffs. French diplomats trying to preserve NATO while Trump demands tribute. Polish leaders who remember what submission to an empire actually feels like. He reached back to a moment when Europeans were forced to display loyalty they didn't feel, forced to proclaim unity with a system that oppressed them, forced to hang signs in their windows that represented their own subjugation. And he made them ask themselves, are we hanging those signs again? Here's what most people missed about that speech. Carney didn't write it last week. He's been preparing for that exact moment his entire adult life. Edmonton, late 1970s. A nerdy teenager hitting the books, mastering numbers, playing hockey, building the foundation of what would become one of the most remarkable careers in modern finance. He wasn't just studying economics, he was developing the capacity to see patterns that others couldn't, to understand systems at a depth that literally no one else could match. Fast forward through Harvard, Oxford, Goldman Sachs, through his appointment as governor of the Bank of Canada in 2008, right as the global financial crisis hit, through his unprecedented move to become governor of the Bank of England in 2013, the first foreigner to hold that position in the institution's 300-year history. Through countless speeches at Davos and everywhere else, the world's financial elite gathered. By the time Carney stood at that podium on Tuesday, he had spent decades becoming the smartest person in every room he entered. Not the most charismatic, not the most politically skilled, the smartest, with deeper insight into the world financial system than literally anyone else alive. When financial journalists covered his speeches about bank regulation, the details were dry, technical, often impenetrable to general audiences. But watch the other economists in those rooms. Watch the bankers. Watch the financial experts. They didn't zone out. They leaned forward. They hung on every word, because Carney wasn't just explaining regulations, he was revealing how the entire global system actually worked. And on Tuesday, he deployed all of that accumulated expertise, all of that hard-won credibility, all of that carefully built authority to deliver a message that no other leader could have delivered with the same impact. If the US no longer wants to lead, Canada will. He said that during the campaign. Most observers dismissed it as political rhetoric, standard sovereignty talk designed to appeal to nationalist sentiment without meaning anything concrete. They were utterly incorrect. Because on Tuesday in Davos, Carney didn't just repeat that line, he demonstrated exactly what it meant. He rallied the world's elite to resist American demands, not through confrontation, not through military posturing, through calm, carefully reasoned persuasion grounded in moral clarity. The speech, which he apparently wrote himself, was a masterclass in crisis leadership. He didn't attack Trump directly. He didn't lecture the Europeans about courage. He told them a story about what happens when people accept subordination, when they perform sovereignty while accepting domination, when they hang signs in their windows proclaiming loyalty to a system they know is wrong. And then he showed them the alternative. Canada, standing firm, refusing to capitulate. leading by example. Dear viewers, something extraordinary happened in that room on Tuesday. The Europeans weren't just listening politely to another speech from another world leader. They were witnessing the emergence of a new kind of leadership at exactly the moment when they needed it most. Raymond Blake, author of Canada's Prime Ministers and the Shaping of a National Identity, put it bluntly, I cannot think of a speech from any other prime minister that had such an impact. Those are rare opportunities to capture international attention, and Carney knew that. He did not disappoint. Think about that assessment. In the entire history of Canadian prime ministers, from Macdonald through Laurier, from King through Pearson, from Trudeau Sr. through Chrétien and Harper, and Trudeau Jr., no speech has had this kind of immediate global impact. Carney seized a moment of maximum uncertainty and turned it into a demonstration of Canadian leadership that will reshape how the world sees this country for years to come. Donald Trump's reaction came Wednesday, predictable, narcissistic, revealing. Canada lives because of the United States. Translation: submit or suffer. This is the language of empire, not alliance, not partnership, empire. The same mindset that demanded European subordination, the same worldview that sees sovereignty as something granted by Washington rather than inherent to nations. But here's what Trump doesn't understand. Here's what his entire approach fundamentally misses. Canadians have a choice. Yes, American tariffs could devastate the Canadian economy. Yes, ripping up CUSMA could cause immediate economic pain. Yes, submission might preserve short-term prosperity. But do we want to live on our knees? That's the real question Carney posed in Davos, and it's the question that every Canadian now has to answer. Are we willing to accept subordination in exchange for economic security? Are we willing to hang signs in our windows proclaiming loyalty to an empire that sees us as subjects rather than partners? Are we willing to perform sovereignty while accepting domination? Carney's answer is clear. Canada will lead. Canada will resist. Canada will not subordinate its dignity to American demands. And the early political impact? It's already visible. Ottawa tonight. Pierre Poilievre is facing the crisis he's been dreading since Trump's re-election. His party is splitting between pro-Trump and anti-Trump factions, and Carney's Davos triumph just made that split impossible to paper over. The pro-Trump conservatives look increasingly out of touch with Canadian sentiment. The anti-Trump conservatives are wondering why they're not supporting Carney, and moderate MPs are quietly making phone calls about potential floor crossings. Carney doesn't have a majority yet, but watch what happens over the next few weeks. After Poilievre survives his leadership review, which seems likely despite the pressure, expect at least a few Conservative MPs to cross the floor, each one citing Carney's leadership, each one referencing the Davos speech, each one explaining that this is what Canadian sovereignty actually looks like. The political calculation is straightforward. Carney demonstrated leadership at a moment of maximum global crisis. He showed Canadians that it's possible to stand up to American pressure without collapsing. He proved that Canada can lead when America won't. That's not just good politics. That's transformational politics. But here's the warning from history. Lester Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for his work resolving the Suez Crisis. Canadians were enormously proud. International acclaim surged. Pearson seemed destined for lasting political success. And yet his time as Prime Minister, while productive in policy terms, was marked by minority governments, political struggles, and frequent crises. The international laurels didn't translate to sustained domestic support. Carney's team knows this history. They understand that a triumph in Davos doesn't guarantee success in Saskatoon or Surrey. Everything depends on whether Carney can produce economic results for Canadians, whether he can navigate the coming trade war without devastating the economy, whether he can build the alternative partnerships that make Canadian independence sustainable rather than just rhetorically appealing. The speech bought him political space, it gave him credibility, it positioned him as the leader Canada needs for this particular moment. But moments pass, crises evolve, and leadership requires more than one great speech. Here's what strikes me most about this entire sequence. When Carney entered politics at 60, shifting from the world of central banking to the chaos of parliamentary democracy, many observers questioned whether his skills would transfer. Could someone so accustomed to tech, necratic policymaking connect with voters? Could someone known for his arrogance and high-handed treatment of journalists build the coalition necessary for political success? The answer is becoming clear. In normal circumstances, probably not. Carney's strengths are not traditional political skills. He's not a natural retail politician. He doesn't excel at the glad-handing and small talk that typically characterize successful Democratic leaders, but these are not normal circumstances. In the fearful atmosphere that prevailed after Trump's re-election, Canadians didn't need a friendly face. They needed a calm, experienced crisis manager, someone who had navigated the 2008 financial collapse, someone who had stabilized the British economy during Brexit uncertainty, someone who understood how global systems work at a depth that no other Canadian politician could match. Carney is that person, and the Davos speech proved it. He showed backbone precisely when Europe needed to see that spines still exist in Western leadership. He demonstrated moral clarity at a moment when moral confusion threatened to paralyze democratic response to autocratic pressure. He offered an alternative vision of the future at exactly the instant when the old vision was crumbling. This is crisis management at the highest level, not just responding to events, shaping them, not just reacting to Trump's provocations, redefining the terms of engagement entirely. So, where does this leave Canada? Where does it leave Carney? Where does it leave the fundamental question of whether we can build prosperity on dignity rather than subordination? Nobody knows yet. The trade war Trump threatens could still materialize. The economic pain could still arrive. The political coalition Carney is building could still fracture under the pressure of real-world consequences. But something shifted in Davos on Tuesday, something fundamental about how the world sees Canada and how Canadians see themselves. We're no longer the junior partner hoping for American approval. We're no longer the nice neighbor trying not to make waves. We're the country that stands firm when empires make demands. We're the nation that leads when others won't. That's the Canada that Carney presented to the world. That's the Canada he's asking us to become. The question is whether we have the courage to follow through, whether we're willing to accept the costs of dignity, whether we're ready to build the sovereign, resilient, independent country that Carney is describing. I think we are. The Davos speech marked something specific. The day Canada stopped asking for permission and started leading instead. Now comes the hard part. Trade negotiations with Europe, defense commitments in the Arctic, economic partnerships with middle powers who watched Carney in that room and thought, maybe there's an alternative to submission. Every one of those relationships will test whether Tuesday's words translate to Thursday's actions. But here's what changed in Davos. The world saw a Canadian Prime Minister stand up when others sat down. Europeans saw backbone when they needed it most. And Canadians, we saw what sovereignty actually looks like when you're willing to pay the price for it. Well, that's the Canada we're building. And honestly, watching it happen feels like watching history move